There are two kinds of cold. The first kind is honest. It bites at exposed skin on a November morning, sharpens the mind, makes the blood move faster through the veins, as though the body remembers. It is alive and intends to stay that way. Men in Crestone Gulch knew this cold the way they knew the weight of an axe or the smell of pine resin as something real, something manageable, something that retreated when you built a fire high enough. The second kind doesn't bite. It doesn't announce itself with wind or frost or the visible plume of breath in morning air. It settles. It finds the spaces between things, between the logs of a poorly chinked wall, between the ribs of a man who has stopped eating enough, between the hours of a sleepless night when the numbers don't add up, no matter how many times a woman works them with a stub of pencil. The second kind of cold is a whisper patient, as geology, in what it whispers, is always the same thing. You will not see the spring. For Clara Marsh, standing on the sagging porch of a cabin that creaked and shuddered, even in September wind, that second cold was not a threat. It was a calendar. She could feel it already moving beneath the surface of ordinary days, the way a river moves beneath early ice, invisible, inevitable, indifferent to the lives arranged above it. The aspens on the lower slope had turned 3 weeks before anyone expected them to. Their gold was wrong this year too, vivid, too sudden, the way a fever burns bright just before it breaks a body entirely. The squirrels were working without pause, frantic in a way that looked less like instinct than like knowledge, their small movements carrying the urgent arithmetic of survival. The old timers in Crestone Gulch had begun talking in lowered voices about the winter of 1866, the one that had turned living men into statues along the Sangre de Cristo passes before anyone could organize a rescue. They talked about it the way people talk about wars, with a reverence that contained buried underneath the residue of genuine terror. Clara listened to all of it. She listened because she had learned to treat information the way her late husband had treated rock samples hold it weigh. It turned it in the light before deciding what it meant. James Marsh had been a geologist in the truest sense of the word, which is to say, he loved stone the way other men love their children, with a tenderness that other people found difficult to understand. He had come to Colorado in 1878 with a surveying company out of Denver, and where other men looked at the Sangre de Cristo Range and saw impediment, James saw invitation. He saw the layers of time written in compression and uplift the million-year conversation between heat below and pressure above. The way the mountain itself was a kind of document waiting to be read by someone patient enough to learn its language. Clara had met him at a surveying camp outside Pueblo, where she was working as a record keeper for her uncle's assay operation. She had been 24. He had been 30 already, sun darkened, his hands calloused from field work in a way that office men's hands never were. He had shown her a piece of rose quartz with a vein of pyrite running through it, like a bright thread, turning it slowly so the light caught the mineral's gleam. His voice dropping into that tone she would come to know as his teaching voice, not condescending, not performative, simply genuine. He was a man who could not hold interesting knowledge alone. It had to be shared. She had spent 3 years working alongside him in the field before Owen was born. Not as his assistant exactly, James had never used that word, but as his partner in the practical sense of the term. She had learned to use a transit level, to read topographical notation, to drive a survey stake into hard ground with a mallet, and get it right the first time. She had learned which rock formations meant drainage problems, which meant stability, which meant that building anything on a given piece of ground was an act of optimism so extreme it bordered on delusion. She had carried her share of equipment upgrades that made her lungs ache had used a pry bar to free samples. Embedded in cliff faces had learned the difference between the ringing sound a solid rock wall makes when struck with a hammer versus the dull, hollow sound that means hidden fissure. She had not known in those years of field work that she was building a library she would one day need desperately. Knowledge rarely announces its future usefulness. It accumulates quietly waiting. James had found the land on the shoulder of Crestone Peak in 1880, drawn to it by a geological anomaly. He couldn't quite explain a warm pocket in the rock at the bottom of a prospect shaft he'd been exploring for a previous survey, a thermometric reading that didn't match the surrounding geology. The mining company he'd been contracted to had no interest in thermal anomalies. They wanted silver. The quartz vein James found was barren decorative in the way that beautiful, useless things are decorative, and the company moved on. James bought the land with money they'd been saving since before Owen was born. Clara had not objected, though the cabin they built on it built together over 2 summers, with James's enthusiasm. Outrunning his carpentry skill was optimistic architecture at best. The pine logs had been green felled, cut before they dried properly, and as they seasoned, they shrunk and twisted and pulled away from one another, opening gaps that the chinking of mud and grass partially filled, but never quite sealed. Owen, at 5, had discovered the pleasure of picking at the chinking with his small fingers, working loose the dried chunks with a focused satisfaction that Clara had found impossible to scold too harshly. Children need something to do with their hands. She understood that even then. The cabin had a good window, though. James had spent an entire weekend calculating the angle of winter sun and positioning the single, large, south-facing pane so it would catch maximum light during the months when light was the scarcest. That window was pure James precise, where the rest of the structure was approximate, intentional, where the rest was improvised. When the morning sun hit it in December, it threw a warm rectangle of light across the plank floor that moved slowly through the morning hours, like a sundial counting toward noon. Clara had loved that window with a feeling she could not quite name. She still did. James had died in April. He had gone out alone on a Thursday morning to survey the eastern face of a ridge he'd been studying for 2 years. A routine walk along a route he'd taken dozens of times. The rock slide that found him was not large by geological standards. The section of cliff that let go was perhaps 30 feet wide, perhaps 20 tons of loose shale, destabilized by a winter of heavy snowmelt working into the existing cracks. In geological terms, it was a minor event barely worth noting. In human terms, it erased James Marsh completely and left Clara with 2 children, a deed to a mountain property, an unpaid account at the feed store, the onset of a summer that would not last long enough. She had found out about it through Tom Alcott, the deputy sheriff who had ridden up to the cabin on a Friday afternoon with his hat in his hand, and the particular stillness that men carry when they are bearing news they cannot make easier by trying. She had known before he spoke. She had known from the position of his shoulders. The community of Crestone Gulch had responded with the practiced efficiency of a small mountain town that had buried its share of men before their time. Food arrived. Wood was stacked against the cabin wall by hands she sometimes didn't see. She would look up from something and find a new cord of split pine had appeared. The women of the gulch came with their baskets of dry bread and their careful jars of preserved plums, their preserves thin from the drought the previous summer, their intentions thick with genuine kindness. Clara had accepted all of it with the correct words, the correct expression, the correct posture of grateful suffering. She had been raised in a family where you thanked people for what they offered, even when it cost you something to do it, particularly when it cost you something. But the pity had weight. That was the part no one warned you about. It settled into the chest like river silt, heavy and fine, accumulating in layers until the simple act of breathing required a small, constant effort. She was a problem in their eyes, not cruelly, not in a way any of them would have recognized or acknowledged, but a problem nonetheless. A woman alone, with 2 children, and a winter coming that the old timers were already speaking about in the tones they reserved for things they were frightened of. The arithmetic of her situation was simple enough that anyone could run it, and everyone had arrived at the same conclusion before she had fully finished burying her husband. Edmund Hale arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September, which was earlier than Clara had expected. She had expected him eventually. Edmund Hale eventually involved himself in every significant situation in Crestone Gulch, not out of malice, but out of a genuine conviction that the town's welfare was partly his personal responsibility. He had built more of the gulch's structures than any other man, had brought the lumber mill up from Alamosa in pieces on wagons, 12 years ago had employed at various points nearly a third of the men in the valley. His opinions on construction were not opinions in the ordinary sense of the word. They were verdicts. He came on foot, which meant he had walked up from town, which meant he had given the visit enough thought to decide it warranted the physical effort of the climb. He was a large man, not fat, but broad. The kind of broad that comes from 30 years of physical labor, rather than from prosperity with a gray beard that he kept trimmed with the same precision he applied to his joinery. He stood on Claire's porch without knocking. For a moment, his eyes moving over the roof line with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a doctor looking at a patient who has come in too late. His assessment was delivered with the directness of a man who considered gentleness a form of dishonesty when the stakes were high enough. The cabin would not survive a hard winter. The chinking was already failing in 3 visible sections from where he stood, and the sections he couldn't see from the porch were likely worse. The roof's pitch was wrong for heavy snow load. James had miscalculated the angle, or had cut a corner on the timber dimensions, or both. The whole structure had a slight lean to the northeast that suggested the foundation had shifted over 4 summers of freeze-thaw cycles, working on inadequately seated stones. Clara listened to all of it. She stood with her hands loose at her sides. Her weight balanced the way she'd learned to stand on uneven ground during 3 years of field work, and she let him finish before she said anything. The solution Edmund offered was not cruel. That was the thing she needed to remember then and needed to remember afterward. He was not a cruel man. He told her the mining concern, Harrington Consolidated out of Denver, had expressed interest in the timber rights on the upper portion of the marsh property. They would offer a fair price. Fair by their lights, which were not exactly her lights, but fair within the conventions of such transactions. With that money, she could take a room at Mrs. Beckman's boarding house through the winter, perhaps 2 rooms if she was careful with the calculation, and there was laundry work available, steady indoor work, nothing a capable woman couldn't manage. He said it without looking at her directly while he said it. His eyes were on the roof line, on the failing, chinking on the northeast lean. Claire understood that this was not evasion, but necessity. He was a man who found it easier to be direct when he was looking at the problem rather than at the person. She did not hold it against him. She thanked him. She said she would think carefully about his counsel. She watched him walk back down the slope toward town, his big frame diminishing with distance until the stand of aspen swallowed him. Then she went inside, sat down at the table, put her face in her hands, but did not cry. Not yet. The crying came that evening after the children were asleep. It came as these things come when they've been held back long enough, not gradually, but all at once, a complete surrender that had nothing restrained about it. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall beneath James's window and cried for a long time, the sound of it lost in the wind that was finding all the new gaps the September contraction had opened in the cabin walls. Owen, who was 7 and possessed of the uncanny sensitivity of oldest children who have spent too much time listening to adult conversations, came out of the back room at some point. He didn't say anything. He sat down next to her on the floor, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and stayed there. Lily slept through all of it. Lily was 4, and her sleep was still the deep, unconscious sleep of early childhood, when the body has not yet learned to keep one ear open for danger. The second day was worse than the first, in the way that second days of grief are always worse. The first day has the numbness of shock to blunt it. The second day has nothing but itself. Clara stayed in bed past sunrise, which she had not done since the week after James's funeral. Lily climbed in beside her at some point and fell asleep again with her small hand curled against Clara's ribs. The warmth of that hand was the only thing that felt entirely real. On the third day, something changed. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of resolution, no clarity that descended like light through clouds. It was more like the sensation of a fever breaking the same landscape as before, but the air slightly different, the weight slightly less, the path forward slightly more visible than it had been the hour previous. Clara got up before the children woke. She built the morning fire, put water on for oats, stood at James's window, and watched the early light move across the mountain's face. She would not go down. That was the first certainty arriving not as a decision, but as a fact she was simply recognizing for the first time. She would not sell James's land. She would not raise Owen and Lily in the steam-soaked noise of a boarding house laundry. She would not become a ward of Crestone Gulch's collective charity, packaged neatly into the story of the poor marsh widow, the tragedy everyone had seen coming. What she would do instead, she did not yet know. That part was still entirely dark. She fed the children. She watched Owen eat with the focused efficiency of a boy who had somewhere decided that eating was a task to be completed rather than an experience to be enjoyed, a habit he developed in the weeks after James's death, as though he understood that maintaining his body's function was now a form of responsibility. Lily ate with her usual chaos oats on her chin, on the table's edge, her spoon occasionally deployed as an instrument of percussion against the bowl. After breakfast, Clara sent Owen out to check on the woodpile and to carry more water from the creek. Real work necessary. Work the kind that occupies a child's body while their mind processes what it cannot directly address. She kept Lily near her. Then she went to the trunk. She had been avoiding the trunk since April. It sat against the east wall of the main room, cedar-lined, smelling of the dried lavender sprigs she'd packed between James's books 2 years ago, when they'd moved them from a damaged shelf. She had walked past it hundreds of times in 5 months. She had rested her hand on its lid on more than one occasion without opening it. She had told herself she was waiting until she was ready, knowing the whole time that ready was a horizon. The closer you walked toward it, the further it moved. The trunk's contents were what she'd expected James's field journals, 20-odd volumes in his dense, slanted handwriting, the ink colors varying as he worked through different pen supplies over the years. The geological surveys filled most of the journals. Formation descriptions, depth measurements, mineral identifications, the precise shorthand of a man who had developed his own notation system over a decade of field work. She paged through several of these, not reading carefully, but letting the handwriting itself carry her back. letting the particular way James formed his capital letters be present in the room with her for a few minutes. Then she found the other journals. They were at the bottom of the trunk, beneath the field notebooks wrapped in oilcloth that had been carefully tied at both ends. Older than the survey books, the leather covers were worn in a way that suggested decades of handling the corners, soft and rounded rather than sharp. She unwrapped them carefully. 4 volumes smaller than the field journals, the paper inside different, thicker, slightly yellowed, carrying the particular smell of old paper that isn't quite must, but is adjacent to it. The handwriting was not James's. It was harder, more vertical. The letters formed with a deliberateness that suggested someone who had learned penmanship as a conscious act of discipline rather than a natural development. The ink was brownish with age. Clara turned to the first page where a name was written carefully at the top in that vertical, deliberate hand. Elias Marsh, 1828. She had known the name. James had mentioned his great-grandfather occasionally, with the particular reverence men reserve for ancestors they admire from a safe distance: Elias, the stonemason, the one who'd built half the hearths in 3 counties of West Virginia before the land ran out, and his children's children moved west looking for something else. A man James had described as having had an intuitive relationship with stone that bordered on the mystical, though James had always immediately walked back the mystical part, uncomfortable with anything that couldn't be quantified. He'd say what he means is Elias was very good at his work, and the people around him didn't have a better vocabulary for exceptional skill. Then he'd smile in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely sure that was all he meant. Clara read through that first evening until the oil lamp ran low. Refilled, it read until it ran low again. Elias Marsh had not been a scientist. He had been a working man, a stonemason who built things with his hands for 50 years in the Appalachian Hill country of Western Virginia. And what he wrote about was not theory, but practice. What he had done, what had worked, what had failed, and why. He wrote about the behavior of heat and stone with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime in close observation of the phenomenon. Not heat in the abstract, heat in specific stones, specific walls, specific structures. He wrote about stone hearths, not the open fireplaces that colonial homes had been built around the drafty, inefficient maws that consumed enormous quantities of wood and delivered heat only to the person standing directly in front of them. He wrote about massive masonry structures constructed of carefully laid stone or fired brick with internal passages that forced combustion gases to travel a long, winding path through the body of the structure before finally escaping to the outside. These passages were the mechanism. The fire burned hot and brief in the firebox, and the hot gases that resulted carrying all the thermal energy of combustion had nowhere to go but through that labyrinth of channels. By the time those gases finally emerged from the structure, they had surrendered nearly all of their heat to the surrounding masonry. The stone body of the hearth, which might weigh 2,000 pounds, had absorbed that heat entirely. Then, the fire went out. The hearth kept warming the room for the next 18 hours, 20 hours, sometimes longer depending on the density of the stone, the mass of the structure, the precision of the channels. It radiated that stored heat steadily, continuously, without variation or fluctuation. Not from a burning surface, but from a body. The way a warm stone on a riverbank keeps radiating warmth well after the sun has moved on. Elias wrote about houses built into hillsides. He'd constructed 3 of them himself, structures that use the stable underground temperature of the earth as their primary insulation layer. He had seen in his years of work that the rock and soil, at sufficient depth, maintained a temperature that barely varied through the seasons. In the depths of winter earth, 10 or 12 feet below the surface, might be cool but was never frozen. Deeper than that, it grew warmer. He didn't know why. He didn't have the vocabulary for geothermal heat. He only knew what his hands had told him over 50 years of working in and around the ground. One passage near the end of the second journal stopped Clara completely. She read it 3 times before she was sure she'd understood it correctly. It was not elegant writing. Elias Marsh was not a man who wrote for effect, but it carried the specific weight of something learned through experience rather than reasoned from principle. Don't fight the mountain, ask it for shelter. A man who fights the winter burns his life, keeping the fire alive. A man who asks the mountain becomes part of something that doesn't need asking twice. Stone doesn't forget warmth. Clara looked up from the journal. Her lamp threw a small, shaky circle of light around the table. Outside the circle, the room was dark, and from outside the walls she could hear the September wind finding the gaps in the chinking. She had been listening to that sound so long, she'd stopped hearing it. She heard it now. Her gaze moved across the room to the east wall, where James had pinned one of his survey maps. Not a professional rendering, but a working sketch, the kind he made for himself, annotated in his cramped shorthand. The map showed their land, the cabin marked with a square, the creek line marked with a wavy blue pencil stroke, the stand of aspen to the west. The prospect shaft to the northeast marked with a small X and James's notation beside it. Tunnel. 60 feet. Barren quartz. Geothermal anomaly. She heard his voice in her mind clearly enough to make her chest contract. He'd mentioned it once in passing the summer before Owen was born, after a day of working that end of the property. She'd asked what he'd found, expecting the usual catalog of formations and mineral traces. His answer had been different from usual, slower, more uncertain the voice he used when something interested him that he didn't yet have an explanation for. The rock stays warm in there, Clara, even in the frost, stays warm at depth. Strange. And then he'd moved on to the next thing, the way James always moved on to the next thing. His curiosity restless and democratic, never lingering on any one mystery long enough to solve it completely. She understood something then, sitting at that table, with her husband's great-grandfather's journal in her hands that she had not understood before. James had found the answer to a problem he didn't know he had. He had noted it down as a curiosity, marked it with a question mark, folded it into the category of interesting things to investigate further someday, and then died before someday arrived. He had handed her something without knowing he was handing it, without knowing she would need it. She looked at the clock. It was 20 minutes past 3 in the morning. She put on her heavy coat, her work boots, her gloves. She took the lantern from its hook beside the door and lit it with the taper she kept on the shelf above the wood box. She went outside. The night air was sharp in the way September nights at altitude are sharp, not brutal, not yet, but carrying within it the unmistakable intention of brutality to come. The stars were extraordinary, the way they are at elevation, and away from town, thick and close, seeming indifferent to the cold below them, the way stars are always indifferent. She walked east from the cabin, following the path James had worn between the main structure and the prospect shaft. A path that was still visible if you knew where to look. A slight compression of the ground, a subtle difference in the vegetation's height where feet had repeatedly passed. The entrance to the shaft was smaller than she remembered. She'd only been to it a handful of times years ago when James was still actively working it before he'd concluded the quartz vein was barren and moved his attention to other sections of the property. The entrance had been choked by a rock fall at some point in the intervening years, not a complete blockage, but enough to reduce the opening to half its original size, further complicated by the thorny brush that had colonized the disturbed soil around it. She spent 50 minutes clearing it. Her hands were bleeding through the gloves by the end. The thorns were serious, the rock edges unforgiving, but she opened a space large enough to enter. She got down on her hands and knees, held the lantern ahead of her, and crawled inside. The floor of the shaft was rough, littered with the small debris of years of neglect, fallen fragments of rock, the accumulated sediment of seasonal water intrusion, the skeletal remains of something small and long dead near the entrance. The walls were close. This was not a mine in any commercial sense. It was one man's exploratory shaft, wide enough for a person with a wheelbarrow, no wider. The ceiling was low enough that she had to keep her head down, even on her hands and knees. At 10 feet, she noticed the wind stop. Not diminish, stop. The September night behind her, with its movement and intention, simply ceased to exist. The silence that replaced it was complete in a way that silence in the open air never is. Because open air always carries something even when it's still. The silence inside the shaft carried nothing. It was the silence of stone, which is geological in its patience and its disregard. At 20 feet, she was aware that the chill had lessened. Not gone, the air was still cool, but the quality of the cold was different. Passive rather than active, ambient rather than moving. At 30 feet, the chill was gone. She stopped there for a moment, kneeling on the rough floor of the shaft, with the lantern held before her, taking inventory of what her body was telling her. The air around her was neither warm nor cold. It was neutral in the way that's difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it, not comfortable exactly, but not uncomfortable, stable. The air had arrived at some equilibrium with the rock surrounding it, an equilibrium that the seasons above couldn't reach. She kept going. At 60 feet, the shaft ended in a solid wall of granite. The quartz vein James had followed was visible running through the granite face, a white streak in the dark stone decorative as a brushstroke carrying none of the metal traces that would have made it worth pursuing. James had been right about the vein. The vein was barren. She placed both palms flat against the granite face. The warmth she felt was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she had expected. It was not the warmth of a sun-heated stone. It was not the warmth of a fire-heated surface. It was something older and quieter than either of those, a warmth that seemed to come from the interior of the rock itself, pressing outward through the stone the way warmth presses from the center of a living body to its surface. It was steady. It did not fluctuate. It did not vary with the wind outside or the season above or the hour of the night. It was simply there, as it had been. There she understood this suddenly and completely for longer than the human mind could usefully contemplate. The mountain's own heat rising from its depths at a rate that wouldn't change perceptibly in her lifetime or Owen's or Lily's. She knelt there with her palms on the granite for a long time. The lantern's light caught the mica flakes in the surrounding walls and threw small scattered gleams across the stone. The silence was total. Outside, at the far end of 60 feet of rock and soil, the September wind was searching the gaps in a failing cabin, making its promises. Inside, those promises had no purchase. Promises had no. She thought about Elias Marsh, dead 40 years riding by firelight in his West Virginia hill country, about the warmth that stone holds and the wisdom of asking the mountain for shelter instead of fighting it. She thought about James marking this shaft with a question mark and moving on the question unanswered waiting. She thought about Owen's careful face in the lamplight when she'd been crying on the floor. She thought about Lily's hand against her ribs. She was not a woman given to mystical thinking, James's influence perhaps, or her own temperament, or simply the practical demands of her life. But kneeling in that deep silence with her hands on warm granite, she felt something she could only describe afterward as gratitude directed at no one in particular. It had the quality of prayer without the address. It was the feeling of having been given something you didn't know you needed until the moment it arrived. She crawled back out into the night. The cold hit her immediately and completely the way cold does when you've been briefly released from it, more present, more real, more specific than it had felt before she went in. She sat on the ground outside the shaft entrance for several minutes, catching her breath, her gloved hands on her knees, looking at the stars. The stone in her chest, the one that had settled there with the first basket of dry bread, and then preserves that had grown heavier with each well meaning visitor and each reasonable argument for surrender, was gone. She could not have said exactly when it had dissolved, only that it was gone, and in its absence, she felt something she hadn't felt since the Thursday before Tom Alcott had come riding up the slope with his hat in his hand. Not hope precisely, something more material than hope. Clarity. The particular cold, useful clarity of a woman who has found the next thing to do. She walked back to the cabin. Her coat was muddy from the knees down. Her gloves were ruined. Her hands, when she pulled the gloves off inside the door, were stiff with cold, the cut lines across the knuckles still seeping slightly. She went to the wash basin, cleaned her hands, stood at James's window, looking at the darkness outside. Then she went to the table, found a sheet of paper in the drawer where James had kept his correspondence supplies, uncapped the inkwell, and began to draw. Not artfully, she had no gift for drawing, but precisely the way she'd learned to sketch survey notations, working from memory and measurement, committing to paper what she'd measured with her body in the shaft. The length, the width, the point at which the air changed, the location of the shaft's terminus against the granite face. She noted the dimensions of the shaft entrance. She calculated roughly the volume of the internal space. She wrote Elias Marsh's words at the top of the page in her own handwriting. A different script from his, but carrying the same intent. Don't fight the mountain. Ask it for shelter. Owen appeared in the doorway of the back room when the sky outside the window was beginning to separate light from dark, the preliminary transition of dawn. He looked at his mother sitting at the table, surrounded by paper, then at the lamp that had been burning all night, then back at his mother. His face was serious in the way his face was serious most of the time. Now that watchful quality that children acquire when they have observed that the adult world is less stable than they had previously believed. She looked at him for a long moment, then, "Come here." He came and stood beside her chair. She showed him the drawing. She didn't explain all of it. He was 7, a specific and capable 7, but still 7. She showed him the shaft on the drawing, the extent of it, the warm wall at the end. He studied the drawing with his father's intensity of focus, that quality James had possessed of looking at something as though he intended to memorize it. Then, is it warm in there? Like really warm? Warm enough? Can we live there? She had thought she would feel more uncertainty saying it out loud than she felt thinking it. Instead, the words arrived as simple statement of intention, as unequivocal as a measurement. That's what we're going to find out. He considered this with the gravity of a small person for whom the word live carries more weight than it does for adults who have lived enough places to become slightly casual about the concept. Then he nodded once with the contained decisiveness that was entirely his own nothing borrowed from either parent. Okay? Owen Marsh said. He went back to bed. Clara sat at the table until full light arrived, working through the problem. She did not sleep. She was finished with sleeping as an escape from what had to be done. There was too much to calculate, too much to plan, too many problems to identify before solutions could be found. The shaft needed to be widened in sections, the floor cleared of decades of debris, graded for drainage laid with stone. The hearth Elias's massive, labyrinthine hearth, the kind that could charge itself with a short hot fire, and then hold that charge through the night and the following day, needed to be built against the granite face at the shaft's end, where the mountain's own warmth would work in partnership with it, rather than requiring the hearth to do all the work alone. The chimney was the problem she circled longest. You could not vent a fire through Cold Rock Tunnel without losing the draft. Elias had written about this explicitly. A cold chimney kills the fire's draw. The vent had to be warm, or the smoke had nowhere to go. She remembered James pointing out the crack in the rock face near the shaft's entrance, a natural fissure he'd followed to see if it indicated subsurface water movement, which it didn't, which meant it was just a fissure. A path through the rock, a path that, if she could connect it to the hearth's vent channel, would carry warm gas upward through solid mountain rather than through cold pipe exposed to the killing air above. She wrote all of this down. Problem solution, problem solution. The ones without solutions left in a separate column to be returned to. Outside James's window, the mountains turned from black to gray to rose as the sun found them. The aspen gold was extraordinary in that early light, vivid enough to be almost painful. They would not be watching aspens from this window through many more seasons, she and the children. But they would be here for this one. They would be here for the winter that was coming. She folded the drawing into quarters and put it in her coat pocket. She started the breakfast fire. When Lily woke an hour later and came out of the back room dragging her blanket behind her, Clara picked her up, held her for a moment, with both arms, felt the small, solid, particular weight of her daughter's body. They would not live in the cabin. That was the last time she stated it as a question to herself. They would live in the mountain's shelter, in the warmth that Elias Marsh had understood 50 years ago in the hill country of Western Virginia, in the warmth that James had stumbled upon and marked with a question mark and left for her. They would live in the story the stone had been telling all along, waiting for someone with enough need and enough knowledge to finally listen. The mountain was patient. It had been waiting a long time. A little longer would not trouble it. She began on a Monday, which felt appropriate. Mondays had always been James's day for starting things. New survey, legs, new field notebooks, new arguments with himself about geological formations he couldn't yet explain. Clara had teased him about it once, called it his superstition, the geologist's equivalent of a lucky hat. He'd looked genuinely puzzled by the characterization. It's not superstition, he'd said. It's just that a week has a shape, and Monday is where the shape starts. She had not understood what he meant at the time. Standing at the shaft entrance in the early morning of the first Monday in October with a pickaxe, a long-handled spade, a borrowed wheelbarrow, and a problem she had been mapping in her head for 2 weeks, she understood it completely. The first task was not dramatic. It was the removal of everything loose, everything fallen, everything that had accumulated in the shaft over 4 years of abandonment. The rockfall debris near the entrance, the sediment on the floor, the fractured pieces of wall that had worked themselves free over cycles of freeze and thaw. James had blasted the shaft originally with powder charges, the careful, controlled detonations of a man who knew what he was doing, but was working alone, which meant the blast debris had never been properly cleared. He'd been following the vein, not building a habitation. The floor was raw, irregular, strewn with fist sized chunks of quartz and granite that had to come out before anything else could happen. Clara had done field work. She knew how to swing a pickaxe without destroying her back. The technique is in the hips James had taught her, not the arms, not the shoulders. You are not attacking the rock, you are applying leverage at the correct angle and letting the tool's weight do what the tool's weight is designed to do. She worked in 2-hour intervals with a 30-minute rest between them, a discipline she imposed on herself with the same firmness she applied to the children's meal schedule. Injury was not an option. There was no one to take over if she went down. Owen worked beside her in the mornings before she sent him for his lessons with the primaire she'd left on the table. He was 7 and could not swing a pickaxe, but he could carry single rocks from the pile she dislodged to the growing mound outside the entrance. Each trip deliberate, each rock chosen with the consideration of someone who understood that the work mattered even when the individual task was small. He didn't ask questions while they worked. He saved his questions for that evening when she was making supper, asking them in the methodical sequence of a child who had been composing them through the day and wanted them addressed in order. Lily stayed in a playpen Claire had fashioned from lashed boards near the shaft entrance, close enough to see far enough from the work to be safe. At 4, Lily had a gift for self-sufficient entertainment that Owen had never possessed. At the same age, she could occupy herself with a collection of smooth creek stones for an hour, arranging them in patterns that followed some logic entirely her own, humming something tuneless beneath her breath. When she grew bored of the stones, she would stand at the playpen rail, watching her mother work with an expression of calm assessment that sometimes made Clara feel uncomfortably like she was being evaluated. By the end of the first week, she had cleared the front 20 feet of the shaft floor and hauled out the equivalent of 2 full wagon loads of debris. Her shoulders were a continuous low-level argument. Her hands had developed new calluses over old ones. She slept with the depth and absence of the genuinely exhausted, dreamlessly the way she hadn't slept since before April. Pete Dawson appeared on a Wednesday of the second week. She had known he was in the valley. The gulch was small enough that the presence of a new face, even a temporary one, registered quickly through its social circuits. He'd come down from a silver claim above Crestone that had played out carrying his tools in a canvas pack, stopping at the assay office to record the claim's surrender, taking a room at the single boarding establishment the town maintained for transient workers. He was 60 or somewhere in that territory, the kind of age that field work compresses in the body, so that a man looks simultaneously younger than his years in the strength of his frame and older in the condition of his hands. She had heard from the feed store proprietor that Pete was looking for work. She'd gone that same afternoon to the boarding house, found him on the porch, told him what she needed. She did not describe the full scope of the project. She described the immediate work shaft clearance floor, grading stone hauling work that any experienced miner could assess and price. She offered board in the cabin for the duration 2 meals a day, 50 cents a week against future earnings when the property generated income. She said this last part without breaking her gaze, letting the implausibility of it sit in the air between them without flinching. Pete Dawson had looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I'll come look at it." He came the next morning. He stood at the entrance, studied the walls, crouched, and examined the floor. Gradient, pressed his knuckles against the shaft wall in 3 places at shoulder height, listening to something Clara couldn't hear. A miner's assessment. She understood reading the rock's integrity through impact, feeling for the particular resonance that meant stability, versus the different residents that meant trouble waiting to happen. He walked in to the 20-foot mark, which was as far as the cleared section extended, stood there for a full minute in the half dark, then walked back out. The rock's solid. His voice carried the flattened vowels of the Appalachian Hill Country, a place where men had been reading stone for generations. Whoever shot this shaft knew what they were doing with the powder charges. No fracture damage to the walls worth worrying about. He paused. What exactly are you planning to put in here? She told him. She showed him Elias's journals, not all of them, but the relevant sections. The descriptions of the stone hearth construction, the diagrams Elias had sketched in his cramped, deliberate hand, the notations on channel dimensions. Pete read slowly with the physical stillness of someone for whom reading was a considered activity, his lips barely moving. When he finished the section on the hearth construction, he went back to the beginning of it and read it again. My grandfather talked about hearths built this way. Something in his voice had shifted a recognition, the specific tone of someone encountering knowledge they had heard described once long ago and thought lost. Called them stone batteries. Said men who built them right never froze, even in the bad winters. He looked at her. Who wrote this? She told him about Elias, the West Virginia stonemason, James's great-grandfather, a man who had spent 50 years learning what stone remembered. Pete took the information and added it to whatever calculation he was running. Internally, looked at the journal once more. Then he looked at the shaft entrance, then at the mountain rising above it, then at Clara. Board 2 meals, 50 cents, he said. It was not a question. He had decided. The work changed with Pete Dawson in it. Not because he was stronger than Clara, he was, but that wasn't the fundamental thing, but because he knew things she didn't. A different category of knowledge shaped by 40 years underground rather than 3 years of surface surveying. He knew how to read the way weight distributed through a rock formation, which told you where you could safely remove material and where you needed to leave it alone. He knew how to set a temporary support when the ceiling profile looked uncertain, using timber props cut to the precise angle that transferred load correctly. He knew how to grade a tunnel floor for drainage without making the surface treacherous, a specific art that looks simple until you try it wrong. The floor took 10 days to grade and lay. First, the drainage layer crushed gravel, then packed gravel, then finally the flat stones Clara had been pulling from the creek for 3 weeks, selecting for thickness and flatness, with a patience that Pete initially watched with skepticism. And then, as he understood her criteria, with professional respect. The stones needed to be able to store heat themselves, to become in Elias's conception the lowest layer of the thermal battery, taking warmth from the air above them and releasing it back through the hours after the fire went cold. Mass was the mechanism. Every pound of stone correctly placed was heat stored against the night. She had been firing brick throughout. The kiln was crude. A clay and stone box she'd built at the edge of the clearing, sized to handle 8 bricks per firing, using scrap wood from the decayed sections of outbuilding she'd been cannibalizing for fuel. The bricks that came out were not beautiful. They were uneven in dimension, variable in color from the inconsistency of the fire, occasionally cracked along one face where a clay air pocket had expanded during firing. Edmund Hale would have rejected every single one of them on sight. They would hold heat, that was what mattered. Clara had tested each batch by heating a sample brick in the stove, letting it cool to room temperature, then wrapping it in a cloth and holding it against her palm. The ones that released heat slowly and steadily over 4 hours went into the stack against the shaft wall. The ones that cooled quickly went back into the kiln material. The town watched all of this with progressive stages of incomprehension. In the first week, when the work was simply clearance, wheelbarrow loads of rock and sediment coming out of the shaft. Clara and Pete hauling Owen carrying the assessment was charitable. Improving the drainage around the foundation, people said to each other. Sensible enough, if a little late. The widow was trying. You had to give her that. In the second week, when the clay mixing began in the shallow pit she dug near the cabin, when the crude kiln appeared at the tree line, when it became apparent that the material coming out of the pit was not mortar for existing structures, but raw material for brick manufacturing, the assessment shifted. It became puzzled, then uncomfortable, then, in certain quarters, derisive. Crestone Gulch was not a cruel community. It had survived too much hardship in common to afford cruelty, but it had a sharply calibrated sense of what was practical, what was possible, what fell within the range of things a person in Claire's position could reasonably attempt. The brick firing was outside that range. The project, whatever it was, existed beyond the edges of their map. Ruth Hale mentioned it to Edmund on a Saturday evening, which meant Edmund was thinking about it by Sunday morning, which meant he was standing at Clara's cabin door by Monday afternoon. Clara heard him coming from a distance. Edmund Hale in motion had a particular acoustic signature, the heavy, deliberate tread of a large man who was comfortable with his own weight in the world. She was at the kiln when he appeared at the edge of the clearing, and she let the situation be what it was, continuing her work until he was close enough for ordinary conversation. He looked at the kiln first, then at the brick stack, then at the misshapen variable, industriously imperfect products of her firing efforts arranged in rows by the shaft entrance. He picked one up, turned it in his large hands, set it back down with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling an impulse to say what he thought immediately. He was not alone in his concern. He wanted her to understand that. The community had been watching with growing worry. The project, as best anyone could interpret it, appeared to involve a significant investment of labor in a structure inside an unstable mine shaft, as winter approached, without the resources or expertise to complete it safely. He had spoken to several men who had experience with underground work, and their assessment was uniform. Clara let him finish. She had learned in 3 years of field work alongside a man who was frequently wrong about practical matters while being correct about geological ones, how to listen to an expert in his domain without immediately accepting that his domain covered the question actually being asked. Edmund Hale's domain was above ground structure. It was timber framing foundation, setting, roof pitch, calculation window, placement for structural integrity. His expertise was real substantial, earned through decades of physical practice. It simply did not include what she was building. She told him about the stone hearth. She explained the channel system, the labyrinth of internal passages that extracted thermal energy from combustion gases before they escaped to the outside. She explained the difference between a system designed to heat air quickly and a system designed to charge a massive thermal body with stored heat that it would release over hours. She tried to explain why the geothermal warmth of the shaft wall changed the calculation entirely. Why she wasn't trying to heat a room against the cold, but rather augmenting a natural thermal environment that the mountain itself maintained. Edmund listened. He was a man who could actually listen, which was rarer than it should have been, and he processed what he heard with visible effort. She could see him trying to fit her description into frameworks. He possessed finding the fit imperfect, adjusting, trying again. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to contain genuine consideration. Then, the draft. His voice carried the tone of a man who has found the specific technical problem he was looking for. You cannot maintain adequate combustion draft through cold tunnel. The chimney draw depends on a temperature differential. If your flue runs through cold stone, the gas is cool. Before they exit, the draft fails, the fire smothers, and you fill the chamber with smoke. He was not triumphant about this. He was simply accurate, and they both knew it. Even if your hearth design works exactly as you've described, the ventilation problem alone makes the project non viable. She told him about the fissure. He looked at the mountain above the shaft entrance for a long moment. She watched him processing the concept of a natural rock fissure as a chimney channel, watched him run the physics of it against his experience, watched him find the places where the idea was coherent and the places where it concerned him. When he turned back to her, his expression had not softened exactly, but it had changed. There was something in it now that hadn't been there before. Something that might have been the early reluctant form of a question he wasn't yet sure he wanted answered. The fissure had to be located precisely, he said. It had to be confirmed as continuous. It had to be wide enough to carry adequate gas volume. It had to remain warm along its length in thermal contact with the rock mass rather than exposed to surface cold at any point along the route. She told him she knew all of this. She told him she was in the process of locating it. Edmund Hale looked at her brick stack at the shaft entrance, at the mountain above, at the November sky, with its earliest taste of what was coming in its edges. He was a man who understood instinctively the difference between a project that might fail because it was incorrectly executed and a project that would fail because its conception was fundamentally wrong. He was trying to determine which category this fell into and the honesty required to admit that he wasn't entirely certain was costing him something visible. When he finally spoke, his voice had the quality of a door being closed rather than a window being opened. The risk was unacceptable. The children deserved better than an experiment conducted at their expense. He had resources, a bunkhouse at the mill that sat empty in winter with a proper iron stove that could hold a family through the season at no cost to them. The offer was genuine. It was, in fact, generous. Claire's chest tightened around something she refused to name. The mountain knows things your mill doesn't, Mr. Hale. A hearth that argues with the cold runs out of arguments. One that reasons with the stone runs out of nothing. She kept her voice level because level was the only register that communicated what she needed. Communicated not defiance, not desperation, but the particular kind of settled certainty that comes from having placed your hands on warm granite in the dark. Edmund studied her for a long moment. She watched the decision settle across his features, like weather moving through a valley, visible, gradual, final. When he spoke, it was with the formal definiteness of a man closing a contract. She had been warned. She had been offered alternatives. He had discharged his obligation. When the snow came, she should not send for him. He turned and walked back down the slope. Pete Dawson, who had been working the far end of the clearing throughout the conversation with the focused inattention of a man who was listening to every word, set down his tools when Edmund's figure disappeared into the tree line. He picked up one of her test bricks, turned it in his hands, the way Edmund had turned it, set it back down. A man who builds only with the grain of the wood he knows will never understand a house made of stone. He's not wrong about the draft problem. I know he's not. You have a solution. I have the beginning of one. Pete nodded once, the compact acknowledgement of someone who understood that beginnings were what you worked with because ends didn't arrive until you'd worked through everything in between. He picked up his tools. They got back to work. The fissure took 6 days to locate precisely. Clara worked with a 3-pound hammer and a listening attention that she had to teach herself from scratch, moving along the shaft wall in increments of 8 inches, striking the rock at the same angle with the same force, each time holding the back of her hand against the surface between strikes to feel the vibrations decay. Solid rock transmitted the strike's energy in a specific way, a dense, rapid dissipation that you felt as a brief, sharp buzz in the bones of the hand. Rock with void behind it transmitted differently. The vibration carried further, decayed, more slowly, left a slightly hollow resonance at the edges that was subtle enough to miss if you were moving too fast or listening with the wrong part of your attention. Pete worked alongside her on the opposite wall, running the same process with the efficiency of a man who had done similar work in mining contexts, identifying void space, water pockets, structural weaknesses. When their findings converged at the same section of roof, a 15-foot length beginning at the 40-foot mark from the entrance, they looked at each other without speaking, then looked at the ceiling of that section, then looked at each other again. The fissure ran through the ceiling, not perpendicular to the shaft floor, but at an angle which was, as Pete pointed out, after a moment's consideration, actually advantageous. A vertical chimney ran the risk of losing the thermal contact with the surrounding rock mass along its upper length. An angled fissure maintained more consistent contact, allowed the warm gas to move along a longer path through the mountain's thermal envelope before reaching the surface. It would draw better than any straight pipe could have managed. Connecting the hearth's exhaust to the fissure required cutting a channel through 8 feet of solid granite. This was the hardest physical work of the entire project, chisel and hammer inch by inch, in a space where they could not swing a full stroke working in shifts, because the posture required was one the body could maintain for 90 minutes before the cumulative strain made the work imprecise. Precision mattered more here than anywhere else. The channel had to slope correctly, had to maintain the minimum width. Elias had specified, had to meet the fissure at an angle that would not create turbulence in the gas flow. It took 9 days. Clara's right shoulder developed a deep, specific ache that lived at the junction of the joint and woke her twice a night. She did not stop. She adjusted her grip, shifted her angle, taught her left hand to do more of the work than it had done before. The channel crept forward through the granite at the rate of roughly 4 inches per hour of good work. Owen brought them lunch every day at noon, whatever she'd left prepared. In the morning, carried down in the tin pail James had used for filled lunches. He would set the pail down at the shaft entrance, look in at the day's progress with his careful evaluating eyes, then return to his lessons at the cabin table. He had stopped asking questions in the evenings. Clara understood, without either of them discussing it, that he had moved past questions into the phase where you simply worked alongside something and waited for it to reveal itself. Lily had developed an attachment to Pete that Clara found simultaneously touching and slightly hilarious. She followed him with the focus of a satellite tracking a planet, standing at whatever distance his work required her to maintain, watching everything he did with a concentration she almost never applied to anything else. Pete bore this with a patience that surprised Clara at first, then stopped surprising her. He was a man who had somewhere in his history been comfortable around children. The hearth construction began on the 22nd of October. She had her brick supply, 340 bricks, enough by Elias's dimensions for the structure she'd planned, with a margin of perhaps 40 bricks for breakage and error. She had the lime mortar Pete had shown her how to mix correctly, lime for permanence where the hearth would cycle through high heat clay for flexibility in the surrounding structural work. She had the granite facing stones for the exterior, selected by Pete from the surface debris around the shaft entrance over the preceding 2 weeks, dense and thermally substantial. The first course of bricks went down on a Tuesday morning, set into the prepared bed against the granite face of the shaft's end wall. The hearth's footprint was 4 feet by 6 feet, substantial, almost aggressively present in the space available. This was intentional. Elias had written that the hearth should dominate the space it occupied, that the room should be built around the hearth's requirements, rather than the hearth being fitted into whatever space was convenient. You are building a furnace, not a piece of furniture. Each course of bricks had to be laid with the channel architecture in mind. The internal passages were not an afterthought applied to a completed mass. They were the fundamental structure, and everything else was built around them. The firebox sat at the base front, facing with the dimensions Elias had specified for combustion efficiency. The exhaust from the firebox did not rise directly. It turned horizontal into the first channel, a passage running the full depth of the structure 4 inches wide, 6 inches high, lined with the densest bricks in her inventory, because this section would receive the hottest gases. At the back of the structure, the passage turned again, rose through the second channel, turned forward, then turned again into the third and coolest channel before connecting to the cut passage that led to the fissure in the ceiling above. 61 feet of internal travel for the combustion gases, 61 feet of brick and stone extracting thermal energy before anything escaped. Pete worked the courses she couldn't reach and checked her channel alignments with a methodical thoroughness that caught 2 errors before they were mortared in permanently. The first was a block orientation in the third channel that would have created a turbulence pocket slowing gas movement. The second was a mortar application in the firebox section. That was too thin at one joint. Pete caught it with his thumbnail, scraped it out, reset the brick with a properly loaded joint while Clara watched. He said nothing. The correction was sufficient communication. By the 1st of November, the hearth stood complete. It was not beautiful. It was a hulking, uneven mass of imperfect brick and fitted granite that looked like something constructed by someone who had understood the principle and improvised the execution, which was exactly what it was. It occupied the end of the shaft with the blunt authority of something built to function rather than to be looked at. They let the mortar cure for 5 days. The test fire was on a Thursday afternoon, the 6th of November. Clara laid the firebox with dry pine, not the easy, slow-burning log she'd been using in the cabin stove all fall, but split kindling in small diameter rounds, the kind of fuel that catches fast and burns hot rather than long. The principle required a hot, brief fire, not a sustained low burn. The stone needed to be charged quickly. The gases needed to be hot enough to maintain their own momentum through the channel system. The kindling caught immediately. The pine began to take. She watched the firebox, felt the draw, beginning the slight inward movement of air at the firebox opening that told her the channel system was creating suction rather than resistance. The gases were moving in the right direction. Then the smoke came back. Not all of it, but enough, a thin, acrid seepage from the joint between the first and second channel courses, curling into the shaft's air. Clara felt Pete move behind her before she had fully processed what was happening. Both of them backed toward the entrance, and they were outside in the cold November air. Inside 15 seconds, both of them coughing, eyes streaming. They stood outside for several minutes. Clara's lungs were burning with the specific dry irritation of smoke rather than oxygen deprivation. Unpleasant, not dangerous, a distinction that mattered. Pete's assessment was delivered with the economy of a man who had seen his share of underground situations that required calm overreaction. The mortar joint between channels 1 and 2 had a gap visible in hindsight as a slight irregularity she'd noticed when laying that course, but had assessed as within tolerance. It wasn't within tolerance. At operating temperature, The thermal expansion of the surrounding bricks had opened that gap enough to allow gas bypass. The fix was straightforward: let the structure cool, completely excavate the joint repack, it with a lime heavy mortar that would expand less under heat, then wait for cure. She did not sleep well for 5 days. Not from despair, the failure had been specific, diagnosable, correctable, which made it a problem rather than a verdict. But the nights were colder now, decisively cold. The cabin walls conducting the outside temperature inward with increasing efficiency as the temperatures dropped. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind exploit every gap. The chinking had failed to fill, running the repair calculations in her mind. Checking them, finding them sound, checking them again. The second test fire was on the 11th of November. She used the same fuel, the same lay, the same lighting sequence. The draw took the same few seconds to establish. The smoke rose and the firebox turned, disappeared into the first channel. No seepage. The joint held. The gases were moving. She fed the fire for 90 minutes, adding fuel at intervals to maintain the high temperature the system required during its initial charge cycle. At 45 minutes, she put her palm against the lowest section of the hearth's exterior, the part furthest from the firebox, the section the gases reached last. Cool. At 60 minutes, the same section had moved from cool to neutral. At 90 minutes, it was perceptibly warm. She let the fire burn down without adding more fuel. Then, she sat down on the stone floor, 4 feet from the hearth's face, and waited. Pete sat across from her. The lantern light moved slightly in the air currents. The temperature differential was creating a gentle, natural convection, entirely different from the violent air movement of a conventional stove's heat. Warmer air rising from the hearth surface, cooler air moving to replace it at floor level. A slow circulation that was less like a fire heating a room than like a room waking gradually from cold sleep. Owen had come down at the end of the school day and sat near the entrance with Lily, watching from a safe distance. Lily had fallen asleep against Owen's shoulder within 20 minutes. Owen remained awake, watching his mother sitting on the stone floor, watching the hearth, saying nothing. 4 hours after the fire went cold, Clara placed both palms flat against the hearth's face. The stone was warm throughout not merely the sections nearest the firebox, but the full exterior surface, a consistent, even warmth that the structure had distributed through its mass during the charge cycle. The internal channels had done what Elias's design required them to do. The thermal energy of 90 minutes of fire had been distributed through 2,000 pounds of brick and stone, which would now release it slowly, hour by hour, without any additional fuel, without any further tending, without any flame. Pete placed his own hand against the hearth's face, held it there, then removed it. My grandfather talked about these. His voice was the voice of someone locating something they had thought permanently lost. Said the men who built them right could leave for 3 days and come home to a warm house. A pause in which he seemed to be deciding how much of what he was feeling was appropriate to say. I thought he was exaggerating. Claire looked at him. He was being precise. Pete stood for another moment with his hand no longer touching the hearth, but his body still oriented toward it, as though the warmth were a conversation he wasn't finished with. Then he looked at the entrance where Owen sat with his sleeping sister, and then at Clara. We should finish the floor in the living section. Weather's coming. I can feel it in how the rock smells. She had learned over 6 weeks of working with Pete to credit the things he claimed to know through unconventional means. He had been right about subsurface water movement from the smell of certain sections of wall. He had been right about the location of a secondary fissure she'd missed during her initial search. He knew things about what rock was doing that he couldn't fully explain in language, because the knowledge lived in his body rather than in his mind, accumulated through 40 years of attention to environments that killed people who didn't pay attention. She looked at the entrance at the quality of the light, coming in the color of the sky visible beyond it. The sky was the wrong color, not storm gray, not the ordinary gray of late autumn overcast. Something deeper, more saturated, the particular purple bruised shade that she had seen once before in her life during a November in Pueblo, 12 years ago, the day before a storm that had shut down the entire county for 4 days. She looked at Pete. He nodded once, confirming what she'd already understood. They spent the next 3 days finishing everything. The living section floor, the widened chamber at the 40-foot mark, the section with ceiling height enough to stand upright, received its final layer of fitted flat stones. The bunks came in as simple frames of salvaged lumber from a collapsed sluice box Pete had located a half-mile upstream, rough but sound, the planks sanded to remove the worst of the splinter hazard. The food stores came from the cabin. Everything that would keep transferred in crates and wrapped in canvas, stacked in the cool side alcove where the temperature would hold provisions without freezing them. The oil supply for the lamps. The water barrel filled and covered. The blankets from the cabin's supplies, supplemented by two that Pete contributed from his bedroll without comment. Lily helped with the transfer in the way that 4-year-olds help enthusiastically, with results that required quiet correction, dropping one jar of preserved plums that hit the stone floor and did not survive the encounter. Accepting the loss with a philosophical equanimity that Owen, who had been carrying the crate, took longer to arrive at. On the morning of the 14th of November, Clara fired the hearth for the third time. She fed it for 2 hours rather than 90 minutes, loading the firebox to its capacity in the final 20 minutes to push the maximum thermal charge into the stone. When she damped the firebox down and felt the pull of air at the opening cease, the structure had achieved the temperature. It would now hold for the next 20 hours, releasing it steadily into the chamber, into the floor, stones, into the air that moved in slow, warm circulation from the shaft's depths outward. The broom went last. She went to the cabin one final time, moving through its rooms with the particular attention of someone taking inventory of a place they are leaving. The window James had calculated was still throwing its morning light across the floor, the rectangle sharp-edged on the planks. She stood in it for a moment. She did not take the window with her. She took the journals. Outside, the sky had moved from purple bruised to something that had no good name. In ordinary weather, vocabulary, a color between gray and white that had absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, that made the world below it look flattened and preparatory. The wind had stopped entirely, which was not calm. Calm was an absence. This was a held breath. The first precipitation came as she was crossing from the cabin to the shaft entrance carrying the last load. Not snow, not yet. Hard, fine pellets of ice, driven not by wind, but by their own density, hissing against her coat, accumulating in the creases of her sleeves with a dry, crystalline sound. Owen held Lily's hand at the shaft entrance, both of them looking at the sky with the same expression, which was not fear exactly, but its more useful relative attention without panic, the stance of people who have somewhere safe to go. She ushered them in ahead of her. She stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at the cabin, at the clearing, at the aspen stand that was now bare and gray, at the mountain above her with its snow cap that had been growing for 6 weeks. The pellets were thickening. The light was flattening further. She turned. She went inside. The warmth met her at the 30-foot mark, as it always did, as it would always do. Not a dramatic heat, but a presence. The stone's patient exhalation, the mountain's quiet answer to a question she had asked it at 4 in the morning 6 weeks ago, with her hands pressed flat against its deepest accessible face. Behind her, the world closed itself in white. The storm arrived without the courtesy of gradation. 1 hour, the pellets were ticking against the cabin's remaining window, small and exploratory, the way a conversation begins before either party has committed to the argument they're about to have. The next hour, the window was gone from perception entirely. Not broken, not removed, simply irrelevant, because the world beyond it had ceased to have visible content. The white was total. It was not the romantic white of Christmas illustrations or the quiet white of ordinary snowfall. It was operational white, industrial white. The white of a force that had decided the landscape required resetting from first principles. Inside the shaft, none of this registered as sound. That was the first thing that settled into Clara's understanding in those early hours. Not as relief exactly, but as a kind of astonished recalibration. She had expected some acoustic evidence of what was happening above them, some low transmitted frequency, some vibration in the floor stones that would announce the storm's arrival and scale. There was nothing. The mountain between the chamber's ceiling and the surface above absorbed the noise of the wind the way deep water absorbs the noise of rain completely without comment. The silence in the chamber was the same silence it had been on every previous day. The stone did not distinguish between one kind of weather above it and another. Pete had taken the outer position, his bedroll closest to the shaft entrance. He had said only that he'd slept in worse accommodations in conditions that hadn't had the advantage of functional heating, which was true in a way that settled the question without requiring further discussion. He was asleep within 20 minutes of their final entry, the uncomplicated sleep of someone whose body had learned to take rest when rest was available without waiting for circumstances to become ideal. Owen lay on his bunk with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling of the chamber. Clara could see from across the room that he was not frightened. His breathing was the steady rhythm of a child at rest, not the shallow, irregular breathing of one managing fear. He was processing. She recognized the posture from the weeks after James's death, that specific stillness that meant his mind was working through something too large for ordinary conversation, sorting it into the categories that would eventually allow him to carry it. Lily slept with her characteristic totality, one arm thrown across the blanket. Her face completely relaxed, nothing in her expression suggesting any awareness that the world above her was dismantling itself. Clara sat at the table and did not sleep. What she felt now was different from the fear she'd carried through the weeks of construction. Quieter. A settling, a return to baseline from a state of sustained alert that the body hadn't fully acknowledged it was maintaining. The hearth had been radiating for 7 hours when she finally placed her palm against its lower exterior face before trying to sleep. The warmth that met her hand was even consistent, unchanged from the reading she'd taken 4 hours earlier. The stone remembered what it had been given. It was keeping its part of the arrangement. She slept. In town, 3 miles down the mountain, and 400 feet lower in elevation, the storm was conducting a different kind of education. Edmund Hale's house was the finest structure in Creston Gulch by any conventional measure. He had built it himself over 3 summers, bringing lumber from the mill in carefully selected lots, taking the time to air dry the boards before using them, fitting the tongue and groove wall sections with the precision he applied to every structural commission. The foundation was fieldstone, properly mortared, properly seated below the frost line. The roof pitch was calculated for the maximum anticipated snow load. The iron stove in the main room was a Monarch Radiant the best commercially available model in 1884, shipped from Chicago at considerable expense. By every standard, Edmund understood his house was ready. The Monarch burned through its first full load of seasoned oak in 6 hours. In a normal Colorado winter, a full load of seasoned oak in a Monarch Radiant heated a well built room to comfortable temperature for 8 hours. It was not a ratio he had ever had reason to question. He was questioning it now. The room's temperature had peaked at something tolerable around hour 3 and then begun declining despite the stove's continuous output. By hour 6, the air near the ceiling was marginally warmer than the air near the floor, which was the correct direction for convection to operate. But the floor air was cold in a way that made the distinction largely academic. Ruth had moved their daughters to the bed, the one interior room without exterior wall exposure, and piled it with everything fabric in the house. The physics of what was happening were not mysterious to Edmund. In retrospect, though they had not been visible to him before the storm made them unavoidable. Every cubic foot of warm air that rose to his ceiling was warm air under pressure, and pressure found its way out through every imperfection in his envelope. The inevitable shrinkage gaps between boards, the tolerant spaces around window frames, the junction between wall and roof where no amount of care could achieve perfect seal. Each escape of warm air required replacement. The replacement came from outside, from the negative 40-degree reservoir that the storm had installed around his house, with total thoroughness entering through the same gaps the warm air had left through. He was not heating a room. He was heating a process, an exchange, a negotiation with the outside air that the outside air was winning at every margin. He fed the stove through the night. He sat in the chair nearest the stove, close enough to feel the radiant output from the iron body feeding it at intervals, watching the fuel diminish with an attention that had nowhere useful to direct itself, but the calculation of how long the wood supply would last against how long the storm would last. By the second day, he was burning pine. Not the dry, well-split pine he kept for kindling that had been consumed in the first day's firing. The pine he was burning now was the green-cut timber he'd rejected for construction last summer, the stuff he'd kept in the side yard, meaning to let it season another year. It burned poorly. It threw smoke backward through the draft when the wind gusted against the chimney cap. It deposited creosote in the flue at a rate that raised the genuine possibility of a chimney fire on top of everything else. Ruth came out of the bedroom at some point during the second morning, moving with the careful precision of someone who was conserving heat through the economy of motion. She did not say anything about the temperature. She looked at his face, then at the wood supply, then back at his face. The communication was complete without words. By the third day, his certainty had become a liability he was carrying without knowing how to set down. 30 years of building had given Edmund Hale a model of the world that worked. Walls kept wind out, sealed envelopes held heat in, good iron stoves properly fueled maintained livable temperatures. These were not opinions. They were the observable results of 30 years of empirical practice. What the storm was demonstrating was that the model had conditions under which it broke down conditions more extreme than anything he designed against conditions that revealed the fundamental vulnerability of a system built on the premise that you could win an argument with the outside air if you were sufficiently rigorous about sealing the terms of the argument. He thought about Clara Marsh. He had been trying not to think about her for 3 days, because thinking about her led immediately to a sequence of images his mind produced with the narrative logic of something it believed rather than something it feared. The cabin roof giving way under the snow load he had personally assessed as unsurvivable. The collapse of whatever shelter she'd attempted in that shaft. 2 children in conditions that couldn't be survived by children. His own voice on that October afternoon, delivering the verdict that had contributed to an outcome he couldn't name directly. He had washed his hands of them. He had said those exact words. He had believed when he said them that he was performing the function of an honest man, declining to enable a dangerous delusion. What he had not considered was the version of events in which his withdrawal was not neutral, in which his authority in the community made his judgment operative in ways he hadn't explicitly chosen, in which the woman climbing the mountain alone had done so in the specific context of a community that had, following his lead, decided she was on her own. He told Ruth he was going to the Beckman house to see if they needed wood, a plausible errand. Ruth looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been married to a man long enough to know the difference between what he says he's doing and what he's actually doing. But she did not say anything about the difference. He dressed in everything he owned that was designed for cold. He opened the front door. The cold that entered the house in the first second of that open door was instructive. It was cold as a physical force, cold with the specific weight and intention of something that had decided the boundary between inside and outside was a formality it declined to recognize. He pulled the door shut behind him before it could communicate that position more completely to the interior of his house. The snow was to his hips. Moving through it was not walking. It was a different activity that borrowed some of the mechanics of walking while requiring an entirely different relationship with effort. A relationship in which progress was measured in feet rather than yards. And every step was a negotiation with a substance that had no interest in being moved. The wind had dropped from its peak. The storm was in a different phase now, a phase of settled cold rather than violent delivery. The phase that came after the wind has done its work, and what remains is simply the temperature it has installed. He did not go to the Beckman house. He turned uphill. It took him a time he couldn't accurately measure. His sense of duration under those conditions was unreliable, in the way that all the senses become unreliable when the body is committing most of its resources to maintaining core temperature. He moved by memory rather than sight, because sight was limited to perhaps 30 feet of visibility through the residual blowing. He had walked this route enough times in normal conditions to have it in his body. The angle of the grade, the specific feel of the terrain, changes the way the ground leveled briefly at the aspen stand before rising again toward the marsh property. His feet stopped having distinct sensations somewhere in the middle section of the climb. He knew what it meant, the extremities being deprioritized by a circulatory system, making rational decisions about resource allocation, but that the margin was narrowing, and the decision about when to stop was one he'd need to make actively, rather than waiting for the situation to make it for him. What he saw when the cabin shape materialized through the blowing snow stopped him. The roof had failed. Not spectacularly, it had simply given up under the accumulated weight, the center sagging and then surrendering the eastern section, folding inward and down in the particular slow, inevitable way of structures that were not built to last. Snow had entered through the breach and filled the interior to a depth that was visible through the open doorway, the door itself hanging at an angle that suggested one hinge had failed. He went inside anyway. There was nothing to find. She had moved everything that mattered, which he could see in the stripped shelves, the missing oil lamp, the absence of the small accumulation of domestic objects that mark a space in actual use. She had known the cabin would fail. She had cleared it before it did. He came back out. He stood in the snow in front of the collapsed structure, and the relief that she was not inside it was immediately followed by a different problem, because if she was not in the cabin, she was in the shaft, and the shaft was either what she had claimed it was or it was not. And the answer to that question was no longer theoretical. The shimmer was visible from 30 feet away once he was oriented toward the shaft entrance. A thermal distortion in the air above it, the particular refraction that happens when warm gas moving through cold air creates a boundary layer between two different densities. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would miss if you weren't looking for it, or if you didn't have the specific visual experience of having watched heat move through cold air in enough contexts to recognize the signature. The shaft entrance itself was clear of drifting. The warm air emerging from it was preventing accumulation. He had the disorienting experience of watching physics operate in a context his model hadn't included. He covered the remaining distance on his knees. The snow was too deep for anything else. He reached the entrance, felt the first breath of warm air against his face. Warm in absolute contrast to what his face had been experiencing for the last several hours. Warm in the specific way that matters, which is the way that means the opposite of what has been trying to kill you, and he crawled inside. The transition was not gradual from his perspective, because his body's thermoreceptors had been so thoroughly recalibrated by the cold outside that the shaft's neutral ambient felt like stepping into summer. His crawling slowed, then stopped at the 30-foot mark without any conscious decision to stop. His body had simply halted to receive information. It had been too cold to process correctly for the past several hours. He knelt on the warm stone floor of the shaft. He pressed his palm flat against it and felt the warmth come up through the stone and into the frozen muscles of his hand, and something in his chest that had been rigid for 3 days shifted very slightly. He kept moving. The lantern light ahead of him was visible around a slight curve in the shaft. He rounded it, and the chamber opened before him. His mind required a moment to process what his eyes were delivering, because what his eyes were delivering did not match any of the scenarios he had been constructing for 3 days. Owen was on the floor near the left wall, a small carved wooden figure in each hand, conducting some narrative between them with the quiet, focused engagement of a child who has been entertaining himself for long enough to have developed a genuinely absorbing story. He was in his shirt sleeves. His face was the flushed, untroubled face of a warm child. Lily was asleep on the bunk nearest the hearth, her breathing the deep rhythm of a child who has no competing claims on her attention. Pete Dawson was visible in the far corner, his boots off, working a knot of muscle in his left foot with the focused patience of a man taking care of his equipment. Clara sat at the table with Elias's journal open before her, one hand resting on the page. Her posture. The posture of someone interrupted in the middle of a thought, rather than someone managing a crisis. She looked up when she heard him on the stone floor, looked at him for a moment without speaking, then stood. The smell of the chamber reached him. Then, bread, something slow cooked, the mineral warmth of the stone itself, the particular quality of air that has been breathed by living people in a warm space, rather than the dead flat smell of cold air that had occupied his own house for 3 days. He was on his knees. He had not noticed the transition from moving to stationary. His body had made the decision and informed him after the fact. His hands were on the warm stone floor. He could feel the warmth moving through the skin of his palms and into the joints, which had been producing a low, constant pain for the last hour that he was only now recognizing as pain rather than simply as his hands. The words that came out were not the words he had prepared during 3 days of constructing this moment in various forms. They were the only word left after the preparation had been stripped away by cold and distance and the specific weight of having been wrong in a way that had consequences he could see. His voice was not the voice he used in professional or civic contexts, the voice that carried his authority in it like load-bearing timber. It was a reduced voice, a voice from which something substantial had been removed. How? Clara had come around the table. She moved without urgency, the movement of someone who has somewhere to be that is not far away. She went to the hearth, to the small secondary oven built into the left side of the structure, and she opened its door. The smell of bread that had been in the chamber's background became immediate. She broke a piece from the loaf, carried it to him, held it out. The warmth of it was visible, a slight steam rising. He took it. The heat moved into his fingers around it, his palms, the cold retreating before it in the specific way that warmth defeats cold when they are in direct contact. He had walked up a mountain in a blizzard to know the truth of a thing. He had arrived at the truth. The truth was two children in shirt sleeves bred from a functioning oven, a stone floor that was warm to the touch, a hearth that had been burning nothing for 10 hours and was still doing its work. The truth was a system he had declared non-viable operating. The truth was a woman he had told to expect no help standing in front of him without anything in her expression that resembled the vindication she had every right to feel. He wept. He did not make a decision to weep. The process simply began the way processes begin when the mechanisms that were suppressing them had been exhausted by other demands. The cold had taken something from him on the way up some layer of the self-management that ordinarily operated without his awareness. And what was left underneath was a man who had built a career on knowing what worked and was now in the presence of something that worked. By principles he hadn't understood, hadn't been willing to learn, hadn't offered the credit of genuine consideration. Owen looked up from his wooden figures. He looked at the man kneeling on his mother's floor with the evaluating, compassionate pragmatism of a child who has had several months of practice at watching adults process difficult things. Clara's voice was quiet. Owen, bring the extra blanket for Mr. Hale. Owen set his figures down with care, went to the storage alcove, came back with the blanket. He placed it across Edmund's shoulders without comment, without performance, with the simple directness of a 7-year-old for whom the appropriate response to a cold person was warmth, full stop. No subsidiary calculations required. That gesture, more than anything else, more than the warm floor, more than the bread, more than the operational evidence of the hearth's success, broke something open in Edmund Hale that he suspected would take considerable time to rebuild into anything he recognized. A child he had implicitly condemned to a dangerous winter was warming him. The inversion was complete. Clara sat down across from him, not at the table, but on the floor at his level. She did not offer comfort in the conventional sense. She did not reassure him that his mistakes were understandable, or that he couldn't have known, or that anyone might have made the same assessment. All of those things were true to varying degrees, but she seemed to understand that offering them would diminish something that needed to be felt fully before it could become useful. She let him be where he was. After a time that neither of them measured, his voice had recovered some of its operational quality, though something in its register had permanently shifted. Your family. Ruth? The girls. Claire was already at the storage alcove. She put together what was available, another loaf from the oven, wrapped in canvas, a jar of preserved plums that had survived the transfer intact, a quantity of dried beans in a cloth sack. She looked at Pete, who was already lacing his boots. Pete Dawson went down the mountain with Edmund Hale. This was not a plan that had been discussed. It was a plan that assembled itself from available components. Pete knew, mountains knew, snow travel, knew what to do when a man in his condition needed someone who could manage the terrain rather than needing to be managed through it. He went without ceremony, confirming the direction with a look at Clara that communicated everything necessary in the shorthand of people who have worked alongside each other through a sufficient number of difficult situations. Clara stayed with her children. The storm released Crestone Gulch on the morning of the 17th of November, which is to say the active precipitation stopped. The wind dropped to a level where human movement was possible, and the sky moved from operational white to the particular exhausted gray that follows major storms, as though the atmosphere itself needed a day to recover from what it had spent. What the end of the storm revealed was not the familiar landscape under an unfamiliar coating. It was a different landscape reshaped with the specificity of a long considered revision. Three cabins on the valley's northeastern edge had failed structurally under the snow load. 14 people had frostbite in various degrees of severity, four of them requiring the kind of attention that would result in permanent loss of tissue. The community's combined fuel supply was below the threshold that made the remainder of the winter a comfortable proposition. The storm had not been a warning, it had been a demonstration. Edmund Hale came back up the mountain 4 days after Pete had helped him down it. He came with Ruth, this time their two daughters behind them, all of them on snowshoes. He came with a notebook and two pencils. He stood at the entrance to the shaft for a long moment before he ducked inside. The way a person pauses at the threshold of a place they understand they are entering differently than they entered it before. He spent the better part of 2 days in the chamber. He sat on the floor near the hearth with his notebook open across his knee, measuring dimensions with the folding rule he carried on his person, as habitually as other men carried pocket watches, making notes in the precise structured handwriting of a man trained to produce documents that other people could build from. He measured the channel dimensions, the firebox proportions, the exterior surface area of the hearth structure. He measured the temperature differential between the chamber floor and the cave wall near the shaft entrance, which gave him a working number for the geothermal contribution. He asked questions that were technical in nature, specific and answerable, the questions of someone learning a system rather than evaluating one. Clara answered them. She showed him Elias's journals, all 4 volumes this time, not just the sections on hearth construction. She showed him Elias's notes on hillside construction, on the use of earthen berms for insulation, on the relationship between a structure's thermal mass and its temperature stability through seasonal variation. Pete contributed the mining side knowledge, the underground hydrology, the structural considerations specific to working within existing rock formations. The 3 of them sat around the table in the chamber and worked through the problem of how to translate what Clara had built into something replicable. Ruth Hale sat with the children. She had brought her own notebook, a smaller one used for household accounts. She wrote in it during those 2 days in the chamber. Not technical dimensions, but observations, the kind that would later become the practical knowledge base for a community learning a new way to winter. How long the fire needed to run for the first charge. How to tell by the temperature of the exterior surface whether the mass was fully charged. How to manage the fresh air intake through cold snaps without losing the thermal gradient the system depended on. Edmund came back the following week with 3 men from the Gulch, his foreman at the mill, the mason who had done the stonework on the town's commercial buildings, the blacksmith who had installed most of the iron stoves in the valley. They came with their own notebooks. They spent a day in the chamber and a day examining the shaft itself, the connection to the fissure, the channel cut through the granite ceiling section. Edmund had told them before they came what they were going to see. None of them had entirely believed him, which was evident in their faces when the chamber's warmth received them at the 30-foot mark. The conversations that followed were not the conversations of men who had been convinced. They were the conversations of men who were convinced and were now working through the implications. Being convinced that something was true was the beginning. Working through the implications was the actual labor, the translation of a new understanding into a new set of practices which required dismantling assumptions that had been load bearing in the previous understanding and replacing them with different ones that could carry the same functional weight. Clara participated in those conversations as a peer. This did not happen with any announcement or ceremony. It happened because the knowledge was hers, the construction was hers, the successful outcome was hers, and the men in the room were professionals who knew expertise when they were sitting in front of it in a warm room during a Colorado winter. Edmund Hale made certain it happened. He deflected questions to her when they were addressed to him, referenced her design decisions when explaining the system's logic, credited Elias Marsh by name with the underlying architecture, and Clara Marsh by name with the execution. He did this because it was accurate, and accuracy had become, in the aftermath of the storm, a value he was applying with renewed rigor to everything he said. The partial earthing of structures was the most immediately achievable adaptation. Several of the valley's buildings backed against the slope to their north. Banking those north walls with compacted earth and stone, extending the bank high enough to provide meaningful insulation across the wall's full height required labor, but not materials the community didn't have. It was not the depth of mountain that Clara's chamber had, but a meaningful fraction is not nothing. And, in combination with hearth improvements, it was not negligible. The stone hearths were more complex. Building Elias's channel system into an existing iron stove installation required removing the stove, rebuilding the firebox area in masonry, constructing the channel mass, and rerouting the flue. This was winter work, which was not ideal for masonry due to the mortar cure requirements. But Pete Dawson had a method using a lime-heavy mix that could be kept workable and adequately cured through controlled temperature management during the construction phase. Edmund built the first community hearth himself. He did this in the Alcott house, where Tom Alcott's family had been surviving on their iron stove's declining efficiency with a wood supply that the storm had reduced to a dangerous margin. He built it over 4 days, working from the dimensions Clara had provided, adapting the channel proportions to the room's footprint, cutting the new flue connection with Pete's guidance. When he fired it for the first time, he sat in the Alcott kitchen and felt the warmth arrive over the following hours with the particular quality he'd felt in Clara's chamber, not from a direction, not from a point source, but from everywhere at once. From the mass of the structure, from the walls, the structure was warming from the floor, that the warmed walls were warming in turn. He had spent 30 years building things. He had never built anything that worked on principles he hadn't known existed when he started building it. The specific texture of that experience of constructing something correctly while still learning what correct meant was new to him at 52 years old. He wrote it down in his notebook, the feeling of it. He was not a man who kept records of feelings. This one seemed to require documentation. Clara did not attend those reconstruction efforts. She was asked several times to come down to the valley and consult in person on one project or another. She declined consistently without hostility. She had her children to manage the chamber to maintain the normal daily work of a household returning to its rhythms. When she had something specific to contribute to a specific technical question, she contributed it through Edmund, through Pete, through the notebook pages she filled and sent down with whoever happened to be making the climb. When the question was general, she let the people who had been in her chamber and studied her hearth answer it themselves. She was not being modest. Modesty is the performance of having less than you have. Clara Marsh knew what she knew and knew what she didn't know, and she applied that knowledge where it was useful without adding any narrative about herself to it. She had built a thing that worked. The community was learning to build things that worked. This was the correct sequence of events. Owen was 8 in the spring. He had spent a winter in a chamber his mother had built inside. A mountain had watched her receive the community's skepticism, and then its interest, and then its respect, with equal composure. In all three cases, had participated in the daily management of a system he understood, because she had explained it to him in terms he could use. He could describe the difference between radiant heat and convected heat, could explain why thermal mass mattered, could tell you why a cold chimney failed its fire. He had learned these things the way he learned his arithmetic, not as isolated facts, but as a coherent picture of how a particular part of the world worked. He carried that picture into his subsequent education with the focused intentionality that had always characterized him. Clara sent him to the school in Crestone Gulch when the spring made the daily journey feasible, then to a better school in the next valley. When he was 12, then to the Technical Institute in Denver when he was 16, where he studied civil engineering with the particular advantage of someone for whom the basic physics of thermal behavior in structures were not abstract but were memory. The specific memory of a warm stone floor in a mountain chamber in the winter of 1884. Lily grew up to teach. This was not a surprise to anyone who had spent time with her. As a child, she had always had the specific quality of attention that good teachers possess, the ability to find the interesting thing in whatever was in front of her and make that interesting thing visible to whoever was nearby. She taught at the Crestone Gulch School for 11 years, and among the subjects she taught was local history, which in Crestone Gulch meant, among other things, the winter of 1884, and what it had changed about how the community understood the relationship between shelter and the landscape it was built into. She was precise about attribution. She named Elias Marsh in every account of it. She explained that the knowledge had traveled from a working stonemason in the Appalachian Hill Country through journals carried west in a cedar trunk, waiting in that trunk through years of disuse until a woman with a problem and enough technical grounding to recognize a solution had found them on the third night after she decided not to surrender. She named her mother with the same directness. She named Pete Dawson. She named Edmund Hale, whose conversion from opponent to advocate she described with the compassion she had seen her mother extend to him in the moment of its occurring, when he'd been kneeling on a warm stone floor with bread in his hands and nothing left of the certainty that had carried him up the mountain. Edmund Hale went on building. He built differently. His designs after 1884 incorporated thermal mass earthen burning chimney systems that maintained the warmth the gases needed to draw correctly. He was not a man who converted silently. He talked about what he'd learned in the way that he'd always talked about construction, as someone who believed that knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted, that the point of knowing how to build something correctly was to build it correctly. He gave Clara Marsh's name in those conversations without being asked to. He gave Elias Marsh's name. He gave Pete Dawson's name. He had decided that accuracy was the form of honesty he owed to what had happened to him in that storm, and he applied it with the same consistency he applied to his foundation depths. Pete Dawson worked as a technical consultant through 2 more winters in Crestone Gulch before the work took him further up the range, where a mining community in a harder situation needed someone who understood both underground construction and the specific physics of heating enclosed rock spaces. He left Crestone Gulch as he had entered it without ceremony. An arrival, a contribution, a departure. The clean, simple arc of a man who had always understood that the work was the thing, not the story about the work. Clara stayed on her mountain. The shaft became, over the years, more properly Finished, the living section expanded the floor, improved the ventilation, refined. The cabin above it was dismantled rather than repaired, its materials salvaged for other uses. The property line James had bought and paid for with savings from 3 years of surveying work remained hers, and she ran it with the same deliberate attention to what the land actually was, rather than what someone else's model said it should be. In later years, newcomers to Crestone Gulch would notice the valley's architecture. It was different from other Colorado mountain towns of its era in ways that were difficult to articulate at first glance, but became apparent with time. The way buildings sat partially into slopes, the massive stone and brick hearths visible in the central rooms, the chimney profiles that didn't match conventional cast iron flue configurations. They would ask about it. The answers they received were always variations on the same history told by people who had varying degrees of direct connection to the winter of 1884. Eventually, those newcomers would be taken up the slope to the abandoned shaft on the mountain's eastern shoulder. Some of them made the trip in summer and would stand at the entrance in the warm air and feel the cool exhalation from within the temperature. Differential running in summer's opposite direction, the shaft offering coolness rather than warmth. The mountain's stable interior, an exact mirror of what it had been in winter. Some made the trip in winter and felt at the 30-foot mark what Edmund Hale had felt: the transition from a world that was trying to kill you to a world that was simply doing what stone had always done, holding what it had been given, releasing it at the rate that stone releases things. Near the back of the chamber, on a stone shelf, Pete Dawson had set into the wall during the third week of construction. The 4 journals remained. They were protected now, wrapped in oilcloth that had been replaced twice over the years, as the original deteriorated, but their contents were unchanged. Elias's deliberate vertical handwriting, the diagrams he had sketched from working structures he'd built, and understood the knowledge of a stonemason who had learned from the people who came before him how to make stone do the work that burning things alone could never sustain. On the inside cover of the last volume in James's handwriting was the notation he had made when he first found the journals and understood what he was reading. Then, below it, in Claire's different hand, smaller, more economical, the handwriting of someone for whom paper had always been a limited resource. The stone kept its word. It always had. We were the ones who needed to learn to ask correctly. Below that, in the uneven pencil print of a child who was 8 years old and very serious about getting it right. Owen Marsh. He was here. The mountain above it all continued doing what mountains do. At the pace of geology, the pace that makes human urgency look from sufficient distance like weather. The warmth it held in its depths was older than fire, older than the people who had learned to use fire, older than the language in which Elias Marsh had written down what he knew. It had been there before the shaft was cut, before the mountain was named, before there was anyone to name it. It would be there afterward. The cold had whispered its promise. The stone had whispered something older. She had known which voice to believe.